All right, so client-centered therapy. This is the video I promised you, or I threatened you with, or I can't remember. Anyway, client-centered therapy. When we look at social work, it's well acknowledged, from international social work to local stuff to where you're going to be employed, and I am employed, is remedial, as we call it in Social Work 306, or one-to-one, clinical, dealing with individuals. Given that, we're going to focus on client-centered piece. And what it looks at is that, for example, we're in this stage, as some people would suggest, between postmodern and modernism. Modernism being that scientific validation, blind, double-blind studies, that kind of stuff. Postmodern is suggesting that we can't know other things for other people, and everyone's reality is different. I think there's some truth to that. So this kind of lies in between, because it's based on evidence-based practice type stuff and research like meta-analysis, right? So when you look at all the different therapies, for example, one of the things they suggest is that in the 1960s there were 60 different types of therapies. Now there's over 250 models, techniques, approaches. How the hell is a person supposed to differentiate in between one and the other in any given situation? And can you ever know them all? Probably not, given the amount of money it takes to get registered and just even task-centered or what have you. So what works in there? Well, the challenges, before I get to what works and how they get to it, one of his critiques, that's Scott Miller and Duncan primarily, out of Florida. Therapeutic Change Society, if you go to talkingcure.com, you'll find it there. Is that the disease model looks for what's wrong, and that's what the primary approach is these days. Although it looks at classification and trying to differentiate between one dis-ease and another, they're not just looking at dis-ease with a hyphen, they're looking at disease, and that's treatable and focus on negatives and is progressive and always with you, right? Think of alcoholism, that disease model there, or diabetes, right? Don't cure it, you just medicate for, so you can tolerate the symptoms. Drug companies learned a long time ago from polio not to cure anything. Spidey can help you too. So from a one-to-one perspective, my job, I think, from a therapist perspective, or counseling, whatever you want to call this, is to make people feel better when they leave the office than when they come in. If I'm making them feel worse when they leave than when they come in, I'm not too sure how that's helpful. And I think my job is to be helpful. So that's one piece. And there's differences in everybody. So this approach really opens up to those 250 different styles, which can be a problem for that kind of undisciplined eclecticism, right? So you start throwing things at people that don't stick, and it just smells like shit after a while if you don't do it right. But it leaves leeway there and respects people for knowing what's in them. They bring in what's available, and I'll get to that in a second. So what we find is then, here we go, so I start multitasking, throwing stuff on the ground. What works in therapy? You see from my little piece I sent you, you look at the little pie chart and you find out that client factors account for 40%. The majority of it is client factors. Okay. After that, you look at the relationship factors between you or the therapist or a clinician or whatever you want to call it, social work in this case, it's a social work class, and the individual. How's the relationship going, right? If you don't get along with a person, you're probably not going to do it, right? I often think of suggesting to a Catholic some Buddhist ideas, and might not go so well. So the relationship stuff. Expectancy, placebo, right? People make fun of the placebo effect, but it works, right? I remember one study where they gave people, and talked about this in a presentation I saw on sugar pills for depression, and that was the control group. And when you told them, they said, get out of here. It must have been a real antidepressant because it worked. They believed it would work, so it will. And really self-fulfilling prophecy kind of stuff. And then you get the other 15% as mala or technique, right? So those are the four main factors that account when you do the meta-analysis of all these different therapies and the rest. You find there's surprising little differences in what works when you test one against another, be it cognitive behavioral therapy versus task-centered versus existentialism versus I don't know, Rogerian kind of approach, probably falls under existential, but nonetheless, or feminist. So the 40% of the client factors are the resources the client brings into the agency and the influencers' lives outside of it, okay? Has to do with the client. The other part is perception. The other 30%, relationship factors, are the perception of the relationship that the client holds in regard to your alliance. Now, are you aligning with them, right? A lot of people feel disassociated or alienated. So alliance is important, I think, when you look at dis-ease with a hyphen. Expecting a placebo, right? Refers to the portion of the involvement derived from the client's knowledge of being helped. Installation of hope, right? When it's hopeless, that's not helpful. And then model their technique as they put it to us. Since they all come very close, the Dodo Award verdict. Since everyone, this comes from Alice in Wonderland, works really well with drug counseling since the story was written on heroin, I believe, and about a mushroom trip probably. The Dodo bird effect. Since everyone wins, everyone gets a prize. So in the end, it's about those 4 factors, regardless of technique, that's beneficial. Now, undeniably, if you're working with a Sikh female, that's going to be different than working with a Buddhist Caucasian male. So those pieces are important at 15%. You can't, screw people up. And really, either you help or you hinder, I think, in this process. So don't get me wrong there. But it comes down to those components are more important than the therapy itself. Client-centered technique and how you run with that, entirely up to you. That's my snippet on that. 6 minutes, 30 seconds. Ooh.